Everyone, welcome back to Period 7 of the APUSH curriculum. Remember, for this unit, this historical period, we're watching the videos out of order from the concept outline. So this should be the fourth video that you are watching, despite the categorization, key concept 7.2.2. You're watching this as your fourth video. Right, this one's about changes in migration patterns in the early 1900s. This is a good example of a topic that's hard to just classify in terms of chronology, in terms of going step by step by step. In that case, this one's going to kind of talk about things going a little bit before and after World War I regarding changes in where people are living and moving, and really pushing all the way into the era of just around the World War II era as well, but just talking about migration patterns. So it's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but don't get too confused. It's all right. It's all related to one theme, all about migration. All right, so the first thing we're going to be talking about has to do with immigration around the World War II time. Okay, now as we know, whenever there is a change in the type of immigrants, we've seen this happen all the way back in the, especially during the 19th century, there is a resurgence of nativism. This nativism is a response to the new type of immigrants that were coming over. If you remember from period 6, new immigrants mean that they're coming from different places. So these new immigrants were typically coming from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, as well as an increase in Asian immigration as well. Different immigrants, new response, resurgence of nativism. And we're going to see that one of the big sort of changes with nativism within this time period is that we start to see not just a social response, but a governmental response too, with immigration quotas placed upon different groups. One of these quotas that we could consider, but it was really more just a national policy, was something called the Gentleman's Agreement between the United States and the Japanese governments. Essentially, as we saw with the Chinese Exclusion Act from before, there is this nativism and basically racism or prejudice against Asian immigrants, and the U.S. government responds by trying to prevent Asian immigration entirely. That essentially what happened is we made it look like it wasn't us that was preventing Japanese immigration, but it was Japan that was preventing it. But really what it was kind of a behind-the-scenes deal of what our government made a deal with the Japanese government to no longer allow their people to come to our country. All right? So that limited immigration from Japan. The Chinese Exclusion Act was still in effect, put into place in 1882. It continues into the early 1940s. So you can see there's really not much more Asian immigration during this time period. Now, one of the biggest things, and that is very particular to the 1920s and the era that we're in now in period 7, has to do with something called the National Origins Act, put into place into 1924. And this is one of those immigration quotas that I referenced just a little bit ago. Now here's the way it worked, is they wanted to put a sort of immigration limitation into place that would make sure that immigrants could come over, but not immigrants from certain areas. So here's the way they worked it. The government said that only 2% of the number of immigrants from any given country's U.S. population from the 1890 census could come. But what this meant was that it disproportionately affected different populations. If you were from an immigrant group that was commonly coming over before 1890, you weren't heavily affected. But if you were from an immigrant population that started coming over in larger numbers after 1890, that meant that you were disproportionately affected. An example, British immigration dropped only by 19% due to this act, while Italian immigration dropped by 90% because Italians were a group that weren't coming over a lot until the late 1800s, early 1900s. Okay, so realize that this was in place for some time, and then a couple years later they actually changed the act so that it's even more strict than before. I believe that they take the census date back 10 or 20 years, and then they make it go to like 1.5 or 1% instead. So what we see, severe steps to limit immigration because of this fear of immigrants, also known as nativism. All right? This fear of immigrants wasn't just tied to this kind of concept of the other or people being different, but it also had to do with the increase in socialist, communist, and anarchist political beliefs that were happening in Europe. Now, we're in the time period now where the Bolshevik Revolution, Communist Revolution, has happened in Russia. They've overthrown the government. There is now a communist government in the world. Now, before, communism was just a political idea, right? Same thing with socialism. But what we see happening is they're being actualized within Europe, and there was actually this fear that more countries would fall to communism once Russia became communist. So, because there's a fear of this system as a threat to capitalism, there becomes a fear of the people who come from those countries. Now, those two things aren't always tied to each other, but the government decides to tie them to each other and limit immigration as a result, and so we see a large decrease in immigration within this time period here. All right, next up is one of these things where we're kind of going across time periods. So it's talking about an increase in war production, leading to people tending to migrate to urban areas and urban centers of living rather than living in rural areas. Right? So what's referenced in the left is that a lot of this had to do with wartime mobilization during World War I and World War II. Okay? Now what happens during wartime is that we're in an instance of total war. And that means that if you want to dedicate your country's economic resources to winning, you have to shift production from luxuries and discretionary expenses, things that in peacetime might be cool to have, to producing things in your factories with your natural resources that are only going to benefit the war. That's what wartime mobilization means. It means that the government's going to step in and regulate the economy a lot more. So during World War I, the War Industries Board, the National War Labor Board were both used in order to make sure that our industries and our manufacturing was focused on wartime production rather than, luxury or kind of commercial production, I should say. Things that they might do, the Wartime Industries Board would regulate what products companies could make and kind of also place quotas on luxury goods, so not too much resources were being dedicated to that. The National War Labor Board was going to manage labor unions and make sure that strikes and labor issues were not going to negatively affect our war effort. Happens during World War I, the time period we are in right now. Now the same thing's going to happen in World War II. That's getting pretty ahead of ourselves. World War II for us is going to be at the very end of this unit. Another thing about wartime mobilization is the idea of volunteerism. You might recognize that term like voluntarism from the reform movements of the early 1800s. It's the same idea of how can you contribute things to your country through your own personal decisions. So some things that happened there: Victory or Liberty war bonds were the idea of you spend your savings on buying government bonds. So you're basically giving your government your money to use in the war effort, expecting that it'll be paid back when you win the war. Of course, only if you win the war. Another thing was victory gardens, where people would plant gardens to grow fruits and vegetables, and whatever they would get, they would just give directly to the government to provide sort of food resources for the war effort. Okay. Now, what's happening with this is these wartime industries were located in urban cities. So that meant that because that's where jobs were during these times, people would move to urban centers and away from rural agricultural areas because they wanted those economic opportunities. Another good example of this that is, again, getting a bit ahead of ourselves has to do with what happens during the Great Depression that we'll study later. It's something called the Dust Bowl. So there's a huge sort of, I guess we could call it an ecological disaster in the Midwest and the Great Plains of the United States. I'll talk about it more during the Great Depression. Just know that it displaced many Americans who were farmers and could no longer farm on the land because the land would no longer grow the crops that they used to. Lots of these people moved to northern cities, Midwest, the East, but most of them went to California. About 350,000 of these people we called Okies, mostly from Oklahoma, came to California searching for jobs that would have been in more urban areas rather than in rural areas. Like I said, we'll talk more about this later on. It's just kind of this is where it fits best, so we have to talk about it here. All right, next up we're talking about a major shift in migration that happens having to deal with African Americans during kind of the World War I era. Now, it's happening a little bit before, during, and after, and there is no good term for this World War I era for before, during, and after it. But what we're seeing is that many African Americans are choosing to flee the South and move north and west to escape that type of discrimination. All right, so this is what we call the Great Migration, and we see, again, they're moving out of the South, mostly into northern cities. Cities that had the largest sort of population shifts because of the Great Migration. New York City, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and there's many others as well. Now, they were fleeing, sort of the push factor was racial discrimination. The pull factor from these cities were job opportunities, okay? Because these places are where they can get away from sharecropping and get jobs there. During World War I, there was a little bit more opening up of jobs available to African Americans because many white Americans were off fighting in the war itself. Now, it's during this time when those wartime industries I mentioned earlier were at maximum production levels. So, with lots of white American men fighting in Europe, it meant that those jobs were available to be filled by African Americans instead. And realized that typically in the past, that void from war would have been filled by immigrant labor, but this is the same era where there are those immigration quotas. So, because northern cities could not fill their labor need with native white Americans or immigrant white Americans, they started actually looking to African Americans as a labor source. Okay? Realized that racial discrimination was still operating in the North. Jim Crow's in the South, but discrimination was everywhere. And it's really just the economic need that opened this up to them. Okay? The main pull for them was the North had economic opportunity, and like I said, segregation and racism were still in those northern cities, but it wasn't as ingrained as it was in the South. So what that means is that Jim Crow, this era in the South, was sort of this legal and extra-legal system by which African Americans were subjugated. So there were laws put into place that prevented them from exercising their rights or for having the same opportunities, but there was a social system that also legitimized white supremacy. When we look up into the North, it's not so much those legal systems as much that are preventing them back, but sort of endemic racism was still going on that would prevent social integration. Okay? Now, as more black populations are increasing in the North and in the West, this leads to race riots. Okay? These are areas before that did not have large population densities of African Americans. So, with sort of this increase, this new other group, I keep using that term, you should know what that one means. There were race riots in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Tulsa in the around the World War I era and into the early 1920s. Okay? So, what happens is, in the North, those kind of racist social conventions existed, but they had such a small number of African Americans that there weren't many chances that they would be broken. But now that there are more African Americans around, sort of it's just the probability that those conventions would be broken, those social conventions, leading to misunderstandings, erupting into sort of race riots. The biggest one of note was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Now what happened is, I forget the exact circumstances, but it basically led not into African Americans rioting. You might think of race riots as that, but it was a lynch mob rioting going through the African American segregated neighborhoods and burning everything down. 10,000 African Americans were left homeless, 300 were killed. It felt kind of like a mass lynching that was not in the South. So you need to just remember that just because we're out of the South in the Great Migration doesn't mean that this type of racism that is kind of unresolved from Reconstruction and kind of exacerbated during Jim Crow, it's still going on, it's still resulting in deaths and violence all over the place. All right, our last slide, and this one's kind of like all over in terms of chronology as well, going all the way from about World War I, even beyond World War II just a little bit. And this one has to do with migration from Mexico. So what you have to know is during this time period is when immigration from Mexico starts to become a thing. Now, in our modern context, we often think of immigration as having a lot to do with Latin America and with Mexico because we have a large southern border with Mexico, and America has an increasingly large Latino population. Before this time period of World War I, that really wasn't a thing. Remember, it was European immigration, some Asian immigration, but mostly from Europe. It's in around the World War I era when more people from Mexico start coming to the U.S. as immigrants. So around World War I, there's about 100,000 Mexicans immigrating to the U.S., and the sort of context you have to understand this in is that we had a tense relationship with Mexico during this time period. Part of that tense relationship has to do with our Latin American policies. Remember the Roosevelt Corollary? Remember we're kind of saying that it's an extension of the Monroe Doctrine where Europe can't get involved, but we can when our interests are threatened. And that's what we do. Mexico is undergoing another revolution, and what's happening is political instability. The United States government was afraid that it was going to cause instability for us as well. So Woodrow Wilson actually sends the U.S. military kind of sneaking below the southern border into Mexico. I think it's like 10 to 20 times to interfere in the revolution. And Mexico knew this, right? And they resented it. So basically, we had a very complicated relationship with them, and as the government would change back and forth, we would often support one that would then get overthrown, and then we would have an enemy as the government with our southern border. Okay, if you can see to the right there, there's this picture of William Howard Taft like throwing this baby into Woodrow Wilson's hands, and that's what that represents. Is it's like, God, I made this giant mess. Take this baby away. I don't know what to do with it. Okay, now Mexican immigration will continue into the Great Depression, but we're going to learn with the Great Depression later on that people everywhere of all races, all economic backgrounds, of every gender and everything in between were losing their jobs and having really difficult economic times. So actually we see during the Great Depression that about 40% of Mexican immigrants that were here returned to Mexico because they thought there might be better economic conditions there. Additionally, and this is ahead of ourselves, but there's going to be a response to the Great Depression called the New Deal, where the government creates programs in order to provide direct relief and recovery for our economy. Those programs usually excluded migrant workers from Mexico specifically from receiving any of that relief or any of those new jobs. So we see that as time goes on, there's kind of an increase in Mexican immigration, a decrease again, and then we're going to see an increase again during and after World War II in the 1940s, when our economy is in need of a sort of laboring or migrant laboring force again. Now, this happens kind of during World War II and after, something called the Bracero program. They were temporary work contracts given out to about 200,000 people from Mexico. Many more came in without those work contracts, and so again, we see kind of another large influx of Mexican Americans. What you need to know about the Bracero program, it was used to benefit the U.S. economy and not to benefit those people as actual immigrants to the country. When they would sign up for this program, it limited their civil rights and limited their privileges. So they had to work typically in agricultural industries, and they had to live on those same, I don't want to say plantations, but on those same nurseries, whatever you want to call them, and they weren't really allowed to leave them. And as we get out of World War II and into an era where there starts to be this feeling of there should be increased civil rights, the Bracero program is going to stand in contrast with the sort of trends where the country is going in terms of racial equality and treatment of immigrants as well. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. So that was kind of a weird one. I'll completely agree with that because it was thematic, right, and not so much chronological. Regardless, you still have some work to do. So you've got some note cards to make with red or yellow terms only. Try to make sure those terms actually relate to this era and not a previous era. You've got a quiz to do due by 8 a.m., some geography homework to take care of, and chronology to study for the end of the unit. And of course another video up next, the 5th one in this series, not just 723 or 731, I don't remember which one it is, but look for the one labeled video number 5 instead for knowing which is the next one to watch. Alright, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you in class. Bye.